Trade protection had some troubling effects. The classical trade theories had long pointed to two undesirable results of trade barriers. First, by raising prices, protection transferred income from consumers to producers. Second, protection deflected the economy from its comparative advantage by making protected activities artificially profitable. Trade protection diverted resources to inefficient uses. In addition, tariffs were associated with cartels, informal or formal combinations among large corporations. Cartel members agreed to limit supply and keep prices artificially high, and this could not be sustained if imports were let in. So cartel stability required protection from foreign competition. The principal challenges to Golden Age global capitalism came from dissidents at the center of the system, not from the impoverished masses of Africa and Asia. British industrialists contested their country's commitment to free trade and global economic leadership. American farmers questioned the desirability of the gold standard. European labor unions and socialist parties organized to remedy domestic ills long taken for granted. They all chipped away at the classical era's consensus on the primacy of international economic commitments over domestic concerns. In the 1880s, dissenters from Britain's free trade orthodoxy originally demanded fair trade, i.e., retaliation against protective barriers overseas. Producers facing competition from recently industrialized nations led the charge. The demand for fair trade transmogrified into a more general call for a revision of British trade policy. The charge was led by Joseph Chamberlain, a metal manufacturer who had served as mayor of Birmingham, head of the Board of Trade, and colonial secretary. Supporters of tariff reform brought together protectionist sentiments, concern for empire building, and anxiety about the implications for the British power of its lost industrial prowess. In the words of Chamberlain, whereas at one time England was the greatest manufacturing country, now its people are more and more employed in finance, in distribution, in domestic service, and in other occupations of the same kind. That state of things may mean more money, but it means less men. It may mean more wealth, but it means less welfare. And I think it's worthwhile to consider, whatever its immediate effects may be, whether this state of things may not be the destruction ultimately of all that is best in England, all that has made us what we are, and all that has given us power, our power and prestige in the world. Another culprit for Britain's relatively slow growth was its educational system. Critics blamed the nation's schools for inadequate attention to technical training, excessive class-based rigidity, and insufficiently meritocratic principles of promotion and advancement. There was certainly a hidebound strain in British society whose potentially stifling impact on economic advance was captured by the American novelist Margaret Halsey. And she stated as follows: in England, having had money is just as acceptable as having it. But never having had money is unforgivable and can only be properly atoned for by never trying to get any. Whatever the sources of Britain's slowdown in growth after 1870, and probably there is something to each of the leading contenders, the slowdown affected the country and the world. Many Britons came to question previously unchallenged verities of their political economy. such as free trade and global financial leadership. It's not surprising that British manufacturers facing competitive pressure wanted supportive government policy like protective barriers around the British Empire. In all this, the United Kingdom was much like other major industrial nations. But the United Kingdom's central role in the world economy was predicated in large part on its being unlike other industrial nations, as it had been since the 1840s. Britain's commitment to free trade and financial openness was central to the structure and functioning of the world economy. It was one thing for such marginal countries as Russia and Brazil to impose protection barriers even on the continent. This was not of transcendent importance, but it was hard to contemplate as a continuation of the economic Pax Britannica without Britain, a pillar of the classical world economic order had trembled. Even in an era of rapid growth, with countries growing rapidly, and even if free trade is the best possible policy for the economy as a whole, economists agree that there are both winners and losers. Before 1914, owners of nationally abundant resources supported free trade, while owners of nationally scarce resources opposed it. A country like Great Britain, capital rich but land poor, exported capital-intensive goods and imported land-intensive goods. So urban capitalists were pro-trade while farmers were protectionists. Farmers and miners producing for world market were the most vocal opponents of the gold standard. This was because a country that was on gold could not use currency devaluation to protect exporters from decline in the prices of their products. The economic achievements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were impressive, but this stage of development of global capitalism did not end well. The international economic order dissolved into the carnage of World War I and could not be reconstituted. The gold standard fell apart, never again to be fully restored. Global consensus of the movement of goods, capital, and people was affected as country after country closed its borders to trade, immigration, and investment. The classical era's seemingly rock-solid consensus on the primacy of international economic commitments eroded after 1914 and was washed away completely as the crash of 1929 swamped the world economy. Fresh business and middle-class interests for whom the world economy was a distant concern, where it was not a threat, entered the political scene. Whatever flaws the classical world economy had, it was much better than what had come before. And despite complaints of contemporary critics, it was much better than its replacement. For the 30 years after 1914 saw the most devastating series of economic, political, and social collapse in history memory. The one undeniable failing of the world economy in the decades before 1914 was that it was incapable of avoiding, indeed may have contributed to what came after it. The decades before 1914 should not be idealized, but the horror of the decades after it is hard to exaggerate. In an influential 1939 book, the British historian E. H. Carr called the era the 20 years crisis, which was wrong only by premature enumeration. The crisis lasted 30 years. The virtuous circle of the late 19th and 20th century saw prosperity strengthen international economic cooperation and peace, both of which reinforced national accord. The consensus in favor of economic globalization and minimal governments was held together by the apparent success of both trends. But after 1914, the world staggered around a vicious circle. Global economic collapse caused national crisis, and national hardship drove domestic groups to extremes. War among the European great powers was no surprise, for geopolitical tensions had been high for several years before 1914. A century of debates has not succeeded in fully explaining the Great War, but there is little doubt that some of its sources were economic. Among the industrialized nations, conflicts over their colonial and semi-colonial interests grew. Territorial discord, such as that over Alsace-Lorraine between France and Germany, was often heightened by the real or imagined economic value of the territories. Purely economic conflicts, such as trade disputes, often inflamed nationalistic sentiments, and vice versa. The imperial territory of Alsace-Lorraine was a territory created by the German Empire in 1871 after it annexed most of Alsace and the Moselle region of Lorraine following its victory in the Franco-Prussian War. The Alsatian part lay in the Rhine Valley on the west bank of Rhine River and east of the Vosges Mountains. The Lorraine section was in the upper Moselle Valley to the north of the Vosges Mountains. Since its reversion to France following World War I, the territory has been referred to administratively as Alsace-Moselle. The strivings for economic and political independence of peoples in Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe threatened the Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires and made these empires particularly sensitive to many disturbances in the military balance. Once the war began, in any event, the fighting turned out to be bloodier, less conclusive, and more protracted than anyone had anticipated. By the time the war ended in 1918, its consequences were more important than its causes. The war and its immediate aftermath drew the belligerents out of the world economy and toward the war effort and pulled the United States into the resultant vacuum. The American economy had long been the world's largest, but before World War I, it was barely engaged with the rest of the world. The war forced all Europe to depend on American capital, markets, and technology, and to look to it for political leadership. United States changed from passive observer of the slow collapse of the classical order to an active leader of attempts to reconstitute it. The change since 1914 in the international position of the United States was perhaps the most dramatic transformation of economic history. From 1914 to 1919, America changed from being the world's biggest debtor to its biggest lender. The European powers were dependent on the United States for financial, commercial, and diplomatic leadership to rebuild from the most destructive war the world had ever known. The United States had an overwhelming influence on the Paris Peace Conference. The settlement followed Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and his blueprint for a League of Nations. Unlike most Americans, many in Europe, the French and Belgians, insisted that the Germans pay for the loss of wealth and life. The overall shape of the post-war world was unmistakably American in design, but the U.S. Senate repudiated Wilson's views, refused to ratify the Versailles Peace Treaty, and turned down American membership in the League of Nations that was meant to enforce the New World Order. Domestic politics in the United States had not evolved as rapidly as its international economic standing. Many in the country believed that it was not in the American interest to be tied to European countries that seemed incapable of governing themselves or of their relations with others without descending into murderous violence. In 1918, E. H. Carr wrote, While leadership was offered by almost universal consent to the United States and was declined. Left to their own devices, the European powers did what they could to rebuild their own economies and the infrastructure of international trade, finance, and money. In this effort, they were hampered by the immensity of the problems they faced and by their deep disagreements. Neither British leadership nor European cooperation was altruistic. The leaders of British business depended on their incomes upon the smooth functioning of the world economy. The British economy and its principal firms and investors relied on foreign investments, foreign trade, and international finance. Moreover, France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, and Russia were tightly integrated into the London-centered monetary and financial order. Instability at the center would be transmitted outward, challenging the basis of support of the political and economic leaders of the countries in the system. The wealth and power of the captains of European finance and industry depended on the London-based system of international trade and payments. It was in every powerful group's interest to maintain this balance. But if before 1914 enlightened self-interest provided the gold standard with both a reliable conductor and harmonious orchestra, neither could be taken for granted after 1920. Whatever common economic concerns the continental Europeans might have, they were no match for the economic continuation of the trench warfare of World War I. The armistice had only ushered in another stage in Franco-German conflict as the French, Belgians, and Germans fought pitched battles over reparations. The similarities between the international economic role of pre-1914 Britain and post-1920 America was as striking as the difference between their international political roles. The United Kingdom and the United States were the principal industrial, financial, trading, and investing nations of the respective eras. As the years after World War II were to demonstrate, there was only a short step from American economic hegemony to American political leadership in international economic matters. The United States administration was prohibited by Congress from official involvement in international discussions of economic and most other issues. The Federal Reserve of New York, however, made a concerted effort to participate in global economic affairs, but it did so surreptitiously. American trade policy was resolutely protectionist. American isolationism was government policy from March 1920, when the United States Senate turned down Woodrow Wilson's peace plans and United States membership in the League of Nations. It was confirmed and deepened in November when national elections gave the Republicans control of the presidency and Congress. The American policy was at the core of reparations. The central post was financial issue. The attempts of Germany's moderate Weimar government to maintain their international commitments were unpopular with a bitter German public, and many Europeans began to regard the harsh payment schedule as counterproductive. But since the European allies still owed the United States government $10 billion, French and Belgium saw reparations as a necessary evil so long as the United States government continued to insist on being repaid. There was an easy way out of the logjam. Forgive the war debts. As J.P. Morgan argued, the war debt should be cancelled, and in return, the Allies could reduce their reparations demands. This would have attenuated economic pressure on Germany, which fed into political tensions, which exacerbated nationalist and revanchist sentiments, which impeded joint international economic action. But a succession of American Congresses and presidents categorically refused renegotiation of the war debts. While many in Europe regarded the war debts as having been paid in full with the blood of millions of young men, most Americans regarded the debts as debts, pure and simple. If the United States would not lessen the burden of war debts and reparations, it might at least have made it easier for the Europeans to earn the money needed to meet their obligations. The American market, the world's largest, was in fact opened substantially by new trade legislation in 1913. But when the high tariff Republicans returned to office, they raised trade barriers back to and above their earlier levels. The congressional response to economic difficulties in Europe was in fact further protection. In 1921, in 1922, and in 1930 with the extreme Smoot-Hawley tariff. American investors resisted American protection, as trade barriers made it hard for the countries that owed the money to earn dollars. Having become a creditor nation, pleaded New York banker Otto Kahn to his countrymen, we have got now to fit ourselves into the role of a creditor nation. We shall have to make up our minds to be more hospitable to imports. The pleas of the free traders went unheeded, for the interests of the Americas lenders and Americans protected industries were diametrically opposed.